Hello, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to the AWP 2022 Conference and Book Fair in Philadelphia. I'm Kenyatta Rogers, a member of the AWP Board of Directors. Here's a visual description of myself. I'm about 6'1". I have locks which are twisted. I'm wearing a gray suit and a purple tie. I also want to take this opportunity to give you a friendly reminder that AWP is still requiring all participants to wear masks in public spaces such as this event. We are delighted to bring you this event today. Before we introduce our featured presenters, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our premier conference sponsor, Wilkes University Creative Writing, and the sponsor of this event, Alice James Books. Our literary partners and sponsors allow AWP to present these extraordinary literary events and help us to keep our conference affordable and accessible. Please join me in thanking all of our conference sponsors and partners for our support and participation. Let's do that, yeah? Before we start, I do need to do some brief housekeeping. Please silence your cell phones. Remember, this is a no flash photography allowed during this presentation, and please respect seats marked as reserved for attendees with accessible needs. Please give the authors about 15 minutes after the presentation to get to the book signing table before approaching them to have your books signed. Lastly, we ask that you please be aware of our fellow attendees who may have disabilities and help AWP be more accessible. Specifically, if you see a barrier to accessibility, let us know by calling or texting our accessibility hotline at 215-770-7291. And I'll say that again, 215-770-7291. Please also be aware of those with invisible disabilities and do not question someone's use of an accommodation. We have chairs up front, which are labeled. Thank you, and it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Carrie Salerno, who will introduce our presenters.
I'm not Carrie Salerno, but I'm going to introduce everybody. I'm Anne Marie McCary. I'm a white woman. I used to be 5'7", and that's what I'm going to stick with brown grayish hair. And I want to thank Carrie, who's our publisher and director of Alice James Books, for being the ground person and for proposing this tribute to Jean Valentine. And I want to thank AWP. Is this mic okay? Because it just sounds weird here. Can you hear me? Okay. And I want to thank AWP for giving us this opportunity to celebrate this great, great poet. And thank you for being here. And for those of you who are remote, we're glad you're watching. For many of us who knew and loved Jean Valentine, we have had to wait too long to be able to come together and pay tribute to her, to remember, to invoke her presence among us, and to collectively feel her loss. Jean died in the last days of 2020 in the middle of the pandemic. Today we remember a great poet who is also a devoted friend, teacher, lifelong mentor, mother, grandmother, sister, translator, and undoubtedly one of the most important American poets of the last 60 or more years. Jean was born in 1934 and knew early on that she wanted to write poetry. Her first book, Dream Barker and Other Poems, won the 1964 Yale Series of Younger Poets Award, and she went on to win, over the course of her lifetime, most of the prestigious awards that a poet can win, including the National Book Award for Door in the Mountain, the Shelley Prize from the Poetry Society of America, and the Wallace Stevens Award from the Academy of American Poets. She received numerous fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the NEA, the Bunting Institute, among others, and she was the state poet of New York from 2008 to 2010. In 2017, Jean Valentine was awarded the Bollingen Prize for Poetry from Yale University. She taught poetry for many years at Sarah Lawrence College, as well as Columbia, Yale, NYU, among other places. But most importantly to us are the 13 books of extraordinary poems that she published over the course of her writing life. In the last years of Jean's life, even as she was suffering from Alzheimer's, she was still trying to write. Even as we watched her become disoriented and forgetful, poetry could anchor her. It was really, there was a bravery to it, to watch her try to pull herself back into the world through poetry. When she and I would look at poems, she would light up and something of her old self would surface. Poetry was her lifeline, her connection to what was essential. Over the course of the last several years, a few of us were able to document and keep Jean's last poems safe when she herself could no longer keep track of them. And those poems will appear in her new and collected poems that will be out in 2024 from Alice James Books. Jean's poems transport us, and yet we arrive where she takes us without ever knowing how we got there, only that we have found ourselves beyond the borders of our known world, only that we have crossed and awakened in some place we knew was there but could never articulate or find by ourselves. Maybe that is the definition of poetry, that mysterious arrival in a place both surprising and yet somehow familiar. And maybe Jean herself was a living embodiment of poetry, traveling worlds as if nothing separates us, not life or death, not space or time. Her books sustain us. My list of favorite poems is long and always changing. It includes poems that we worked on together in our little group, and yet, despite my intimacy with her work, Jean's poems never feel too familiar. As many times as I read them, they still surprise me, move me, make me stop and take a breath, and always, after that moment of surprise and awe, I think, how did she do that? She is our Dickinson, by which I mean an essential and deep lyric poet, a once in a generation, or once in many generations poet of the interior life, an American original, whose unique voice, diction, fragmentation, whose honest dwelling in otherness cannot be imitated. As a teacher, Jean's advice was always incredibly straightforward and seemingly simple, but of course, enacting that simplicity is not the same as talking about it. So she would say, and this is central to her work, you don't have to explain in a poem. For her, it was natural to just be, for the poem to just exist as if born whole from her hand and mouth. She always said that she wanted her poems to be clear, but also mysterious. And as unexpected as her poems can seem, there is a kind of clarity that's not definitive, not confined or explanatory, but reachable, especially if you are willing to learn her language. In that way, too, she is akin to Dickinson, each poet speaking a personal language, a slanted language, as Dickinson would say, and we only need to bring wonder and care to this poet's work in order for the door to slip open and for us to find ourselves inside her poems. Once there, the poems keep opening, reading after reading, year after year, the poems grow. They bring our sorrow to the surface and our joy, our desire to truly be in this life and yet in touch with something other, something we're connected to but cannot see or define. Such is great poetry. I'll tell one quick anecdote that some of my former students remember quite well and spoke about when we had a small, intimate memorial on Zoom for Jean last year. At our Low residency one semester, I asked the students to interview Jean about her new book. The students were in awe of Jean as well as in love with her, and they wanted to ask smart questions. Someone started, I think, by asking her about the use of punctuation in her poems. Now, most of us writers know that when we're on the spot, we try our best to come up with answers, even when we're not quite sure what the answers are. We can't help it. We feel the need to please the audience, to find something to say. But Jean was adverse to knowing too much, too humble to try to find something smart to say. So in answer to the first question about punctuation, she just said simply and quietly, "I don't know." And that's how the interview went. Question after question, she mostly said, "I don't know." When she said something other than that, it was crisp and simple, but for the most of the interview, she repeated like a litany, "I don't know." I think it was the best lesson all of us ever had, to invite us into the world of the unknown, into the mystery, to tell us that our questions won't save us from uncertainty when we face the blank page. She showed us the willingness to do whatever it took to write the poem without necessarily having an explanation or a theory or even a path forward. All we ever really have is, "I don't know." In retrospect, the students remembered that interview more than any other, for its honesty, clarity, for Jean being Jean and not trying to be anyone or anything else. Today, we're hearing from poets who have had a long association with Jean. I will talk about sections of her long poem, Lucy, and I'll be followed by Joan Larkin, Mihaela Maskaluk, Brenda Hillman, and Mark Doty in that order. I'm grateful to these poets for being here today with us. Both Brenda and Mark recorded their talks because they weren't able to actually be here in person. And I'm grateful to these poets for their wisdom and love for Jean Valentine. Please read their books. They are all truly treasures in their own rights. And I believe that there are bios available, right? Is that right? Okay. So I'm not going to take the time to actually read their bios. So I'll just speak briefly now about her poem Lucy from her book Break the Glass, which is a long poem in sections that Jean wrote in the late 2000s while at a MacDowell residency. Jean called me from there. I think she called or wrote to several people because she was so excited about this poem. It seems it just came out of her, as poems sometimes blessedly do. I could hear in her voice that she was a person under the influence, not of any substance, of course, but that non-substance that gives us poems. Lucy is a stunning long poem made up of short sections, as well as other poems that Jean thought of as all one connected entity, a poem that seems to bring together so many of Jean's obsessions. The title Lucy, refers to a famous fossil skeleton discovered in Africa in 1974, one of our most complete skeleton fossils ever found and determined to be bipedal, so standing upright, female, and about 3.2 million years old. Jean writes of her as an ancestor, as the ancestor. As her imagination is captured by Lucy, Jean travels outside of time, calling Lucy mother and writing of her receiving the dead. Lucy, when Jane in her last clothes goes across with Chekhov, you are the ferryman. The Jane she's referring to in the poem is the poet Jane Cooper, Jean's longtime colleague and friend who had recently died. The poem is part elegy, part joyful quest for a thread through history, for something to anchor the poet deep in the past. In Lucy, Jean stakes a claim to her not-so-secret mysticism, the connection that she understands is between all things, the energy we are all made of. In Lucy, she writes from that place where all past, present, all future, where the living, the dead, the here and the now, and the no time are all as one. Lucy, the long ago being she invokes, is all compassion. She is the glue, the love binding us all. Jean drops the reader into the zone of awe where Lucy lives, but where suffering and loss also abide. Lucy becomes the primal mother, birthing us, not a god, not something distant or beyond us, but something still here, present, ever-giving, ample, simple, and complete. Lucy, the creator, the poet-artist, writes in her secret book, "She is the maker from whom all things are born." Jean writes, enter the sweet why. Don't entreat it or question why, whistle why. She implores us to go with it, to stop thinking, to let Lucy, the creator, be with us. I'll read 3 short sections, pausing between each one. Lucy, your secret book that you leaned over and wrote just in the dirt, not having to have an ending, not having to last. In the electricity of love, its lightning strike, or in its quiet hum in the thighs, like this little icebox here, not knowing any better, or in the dumb hum of the heater going on, little stirs in the room tone. I rush outdoors into the air. You are Lucy, and you rush out to receive me. At last, there you are, who I always knew was there, but almost died not meeting. When my scraped out child died, Lucy, you hold her all the time. Enter the sweet why. Don't entreat it or ask questions why. Whistle why. Whisper why. Was sweetness done to you? Done unto you? What I wanted most, the mother, has come to me. Will she stay in my ear? Lucy, is it you? Still, all night long, my Lucy, I entreat you. I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. Thank you. Now please welcome Joan Larkin.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay, thanks. That was so beautiful. Wow. I could really hear Jean. I had the privilege over a number of years of sitting at a table with Jean Valentine and Anne-Marie Macari, and later also with Jan Heller-Levy, listening and talking about each other's poems in progress. What matters most to me about poetry, I learned at that table. Among other memorable comments, Jean said succinctly, "If you can write an essay about it, it's not a poem." I once brought a draft that ran to 3 single-spaced, earnest pages. Stunned by a powerful painting in a Brooklyn Museum show by the Baroque Italian artist Artemisia Gentileschi, one of her 3 paintings of Judith beheading Holofernes, I had done a lot of biographical research. I felt obligated to the facts I'd gathered and had let the information take charge of the poem. Jean could sometimes be, I'll call it ruthless, but most often she was generous and always honest. She pointed to 6 short lines at the center. Those few lines were the poem for her. I asked naively, "Is that enough?" And she answered, "It is for me." That was Jean's gift. I saw that all that information was scaffolding, that you have to take the scaffolding down to see the poem. The poem Jean wanted, the poem she wrote each time, was one that took her someplace new for herself. This meant letting the poem unfold, go somewhere unexpected. Surprise was essential. "We're just here to listen," she said. But this humility of Jean's was coupled with assurance. She trusted her ear, she trusted her voice. Like Emily Dickinson, and like Jean's longtime friend Adrienne Rich, she knew what she was and what her gift was for. In Memory is one of the poems Jean brought to that table. It's published in her 2007 collection, Little Boat, exactly as she showed it to us that day. In it, as in many of her poems, she moves between two states. The walls between dreaming and being awake are porous. Past and present, living and dead, are in the same room. Everything is open to her vigilant imagination and deep sensitivity. I'll read the poem and then say a few things about it. In Memory. I was over at your place, but you weren't there. The window was covered, a leafy gold screen, but it was a gate, locked, double locked, and over that, thick double velvet drapes. And then, out of the winter blue, there leapt from branch to branch this monkey-armed woman, jumping on my back, suffering things. She was addiction, I guess, but life too. Skating on axes on her frozen sea. Life demanding life, flying life, demanding to not know, demanding to know. Did you ever think you could do something useful? You know, radiant. First, a note on the language. The title, In Memory, suggests a dedication, a poem in memory of someone unnamed, a friend. Many of Jean's poems address or are dedicated to particular named friends and loved ones, some who've passed on and others, artists, teachers, prisoners, alive in memory's storehouse. This poem speaks to the unnamed you as if in conversation with someone the poet has a history with. It uses conversational phrasing. For example, I was over at your place, and I guess, and did you ever think, and you know. It's the kind of casual speech you'd use with a friend, but it's sophisticated too, referring to the symbolism of allegory in the sentence, she was addiction, giving it a capital A. Then she brings the literary thought down to earth, punctuating it with a dash and undercutting it with the qualifier, I guess. Jean gives us the setting of the dream in an escalating sequence of 3 images, from leafy screen to double-locked gate to double velvet drapes, that intensify the sense of impediment and hiddenness. And then, out of the blue, here it's the winter blue, the word winter, expanding the ordinary phrase, making us see a brilliant sky. Out of the blue comes a sudden wild image. Leaping, the verb comes first before we know who or what is leaping from branch to branch. And then the poem takes a breath, interrupting itself with its first stanza break. The poem itself leaps right to the monkey-armed woman. Can't you see her? And is monkey-armed close enough in its sound to many-armed to bring up an association to Kali, destroyer of unreality? Well, if Jean were here, I might ask her, and then she might say, I don't know. And now there's a further escalation. She's jumping on my back, the wordplay with a monkey on my back, suggesting addiction or withdrawal, suffering things, but life too. The poem fuses being alive with suffering and then delivers an even wilder rendition of the monkey-armed being, the surrealistic skating on axes on her frozen sea, with its echo of Kafka's striking image, waking up the soul, image of waking up the soul. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. Jean's poem embodies that energy of the life force in the terse three words, life demanding life. The line ends with an exclamation point, rare for her, then surges to flying life. In the lines demanding to not know, demanding to know, we can hear powerful opposing forces within us. The addict's desire to obliterate pain, the life force's hunger for consciousness. Perhaps the poem, no, that was a line I crossed out. It's hard to tell because there are these blinding lights coming at us. Okay, hunger for consciousness. The poem doesn't try to resolve the unresolvable. It doesn't turn into an essay. It turns to directly address the unnamed you, not with an answer, but with a question. I feel I can sense warmth, compassion, and maybe something quizzical in the final lines. I love the surprising leap from the word useful to the one-word line, radiant, an utterly unpredictable word separated from useful by the intimate, maybe encouraging, almost offhand phrase, you know? As always with Jean's poems, I feel it in body and soul. I feel inside it and in the miraculous bodily sense of our humanity. You, did you ever think you could do something useful? You know, radiant.
Thank you, and I think I have an image. I don't know if it's going to be projected. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Anna Marie and Joan. Beautiful. I'm going to start by reading a poem by Jean from Door in the Mountain, Annunciation. I saw my soul become flesh, breaking open, the linseed oil breaking over the paper, running down, pouring, no one to catch it, my life breaking open, no one to contain it, my pelvis thinning out into God. In a note to Door in the Mountain, Jean mentions that the poem is, quote, drawn from Helen Ayalon's Breakings. Between 1977 and 1979, artist Helen Ayalon, who passed away also in 2020, created the large-scale series Breakings. She described the process in a recorded event that took place at the Elizabeth Sackler Center for Feminist Art in 2012. She would pour linseed oil on a panel on the floor and leave it to coagulate and develop a skin. And that's an image, the black and white from her studio. She would then invite other women, whom she called midwives, other artists, to come and lift it up and let gravity, quote, make the change. Let gravity make all the wet oil underneath cascade down and fill in its own sac. And that liquid sac, like the amniotic sac, would gush or burst or drizzle. Linseed oil is expressed from the seeds of flax. The word line derives from the Latin linea, cloth from woven flax, and the Old English lin, flax, linen thread, linen cloth. The lines of enunciation are expressed from the seeds of flax that clothe and feed and measure a poem's breath. The linseed oil breaking over the paper, running down, pouring, with no one to catch it, is life slipping away from the impermanent container that is the body, a life destined to fill its own sac and gush or burst or drizzle. The linseed oil breaking over the paper is also a life in poetry, a life breaking open in the process of writing, of articulating and disarticulating what it is that constitutes a life, including the listening, including those silences that, in Jean Valentine's words, are the opposite of reticence and can be, quote, much more full than language. That the speaker would see no one to catch it, no one to contain it, that is, no one but the writing paper, speaks to the humility with which Jean Valentine wrote and wrote herself into our American poetry. Reading Annunciation without knowing that it was inspired by Elon's breakings offers its own interpretive rewards, but keeping that context in mind textures the experience of receiving and inhabiting the poem. As an ekphrastic piece, Annunciation honors and transforms the source. I saw my soul reads as a poet's direct response to the encounter with one of the artist's breakings in the making. At the same time, beginning with the title, we are moored to the biblical reference. The speaker, Mary too, who received the angelic salutation and was informed she would be the mother of Christ, is both outside and inside body and consciousness, observer and participant. A predominantly assonant and sibilant sonic scape, saw, soul, soil, pour, open, over, extended by pauses, white spaces, delivers a soothing counterpoint to the sense of damage and forceful separation connoted by the thrice repeated word breaking and the brief yet haunting anaphorical insistence on no one. The voice beckons from a quintessentially Valentine realm, a dream world or other liminal space where consciousness appends or amends its routine and boundaries, a space conducive to visions, epiphanies. I saw my soul become flesh. The poem unfolds with precision and surprise, from intangible soul to flesh to textural viscous linseed oil, paper, then pelvis, thinning out into God. It enunciates and enunciates a possible arrival. The soul, after both filling and carrying its own sac, migrates or is pulled by something akin to gravity, through something akin to birth-giving toward God. The image recalls the Sufi mystics in search of the divine beloved and the female Sufi mystics in particular, relative to their male counterparts. The latter often conceived of this union as nearness and intimacy rather than in metaphysical terms. Pelvis thinning out into God intimates both the possibility of birthing and being birthed into the divine. It's a moment toward lifting the veil of the beloved. The poem's ending opens the prospect of total permeability, of multiple membranes dissolving between life and death, the womb-tomb metaphor, here and hereafter, mortal and the divine, one and oneness, masculine and feminine. Though they were not acknowledged as such at the time, Helen Ayalon's breaking art performances were feminist statements in their explicit focus on wombs, childbirth, and the relation between procreation and artistic creation. She was on a lifelong search for what she called foremothers and their echoing caves. A search that took her from breakings to exploring parallels between the female body and the environment in the 80s, then to God, to God's body. In Annunciation, as in other poems, Valentine too delineates a space that foregrounds the female body and its relation to divinity. And I would like to turn briefly to another poem by Jean Valentine, Blind Stirring of Love. I'm gonna skip a bit here. From the Cradle and the Real Life. The blind stirring of love. I rub my hand, my cheeks with oil, my breasts, I bathe my genitals, my feet, leaf and bark, redden my mouth to draw down your mouth, and all along you have been inside me, streaming unforsakenness. The title invites a straightforward reading. Full of anticipation, a woman prepares herself for the encounter with a lover. Those subtle allegorical undertones reveal themselves right away. The poem pulses with the erotic and spiritual echoes of Song of Songs, and its Shulamite's lover is, quote, a cluster of myrrh, a sheaf of henna blossoms, her fingers dripping with myrrh as she invites him into the garden of her body to taste its delicious fruit. We also hear the Sumerian cultic songs and hymns of Inanna, which preceded and are most likely to be where at least parts of Song of Songs originated. Here, the goddess Inanna anoints herself with sweet oils in preparation for wedding Dumuzi, king of Sumer. Such union between a man and the goddess who would take the earth king into the, quote, sweetness of her holy loins, quote, her wondrous vulva, ensured fertility for the land, not just for the king and his people. Valentine's The Blind Stirring carries forth the echoes of these foremothers and contributes her own vocabulary, supple, sensual, direct, to a view of the divine within, of the female body in all its secular, erotic, and ecstatic manifestations as an iteration of such divinity and supreme love. In reading Jean Valentine's work, I'm reminded of this line from one of Paul Celan's late poems. Here, deep in I with your mouth, Pierre Jory's translation, or hamburgers, listen your way in with your mouth. What does not materialize into words, what does not lend itself to unsilencing those fields of ineffables, incertitudes, questionings, is an integral part of the poem. In the time we spent together, mostly at Drew University, Jen and I often talked of Paul Celan, of his, quote, words won by silences, of how he lived in Stuart Freiberg's words from word to word. Celan utterly disliked the term hermetic as a reference to his work, and Jean did too. We were both fond of his rebuttal. His work, he said, doesn't glorify, doesn't poeticize, but names and places, and attempts to measure the realms of the given and of the possible. I see this as a feature of Jean's work, too. Her poems Name and Place, all in-betweenness, is about searching. And years ago, after my reading at Drew University, Jean slipped a note under my dorm door the next morning that began, "Dearest Mihaela, your reading last night was searching." In the poem December 21st, Jean asks, "How will I think of you, God with us?" And then later, "How will I think of them and the dead I love and all the absent friends here with me?" Another poem begins, "They think because I am dead now, I am no longer twigs on the ground, stones or bits of stone in the wall," and concludes, "Oh, my darling, where do you look for me? Where do I look for Jean? In twigs and bits of stone and many notes and cards tucked in her books, always in her poems, and always in searching." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan and Mihaela. And now we're going to hear from Brenda Hillman and then Mark Doty. These are two pre-recorded talks, and just give them a few minutes to get the recordings going.
Hello, I'm Brenda Hillman. I'm delighted to be part of this presentation today. I want to thank the AWP and Anne Marie and my fellow panelists for honoring Jean Valentine's work. It's a great pleasure. I should note that I am speaking to you from the East Bay of California, and it is Chochenyo Ohlone land. I've written out my remarks and included a couple of poems. Jean Valentine's poetry has mysterious force, recharging the familiar to eliminate the predictable. Her remarkable images can defy expectation with a single prepositional phrase. Yet analyzing the parts does not help demystify the whole effect. I just looked at an image of the root system of a great oak tree. I was struck by the difference between what is above and what is below. The vast, delicate spread of far-reaching roots reminded me of the spread below a Jean Valentine poem. To find poems for this panel, I opened my copy of Door in the Mountain and found notes from a conversation I had with Jean in 2001 about her dream life and her writing influences. I asked her how she used dreams in her writing. She responded that she liked to use dreams in both concrete and fragmentary ways to reinforce and to underscore experiences. Dreams, she said, would help her tap into a fuller space from another time, and when she did so, a sort of doubling occurred. This corresponded to a feeling I had always had about her writing, that there is a swerve in unpredictable places, especially in her endings. I wanted to call attention to a wonderful collection of essays on Jean's work published about a decade ago and edited by Kazem Ali and John Hoppenthaler for University of Michigan Press. It's called This World Company. Here is Jean's poem, Listening. It was dedicated to Fanny Howe, and then I'll read a few sentences about that poem from my essay. Listening for Fanny Howe. My whole life I was swimming, listening beside the daylight world, like a dolphin beside a boat. No, swallowed up, young, like Jonah, sitting like Jonah in the red room, behind that curving smile from the other side, but kept, spat out, kept for love, not for anything I did or had. I had nothing but our inside-outside smile skin, my paper and pen. But I was made for this, listening. Lightness wouldn't last if it wasn't used up on the lyre. When the poem comes from a dream, but the proposition is that language of waking is inflected with the dream event, Valentine ends her poem in a presence of what seems like a dream trace. This fishing trip produces a mysterious yield into which she casts her net again. The retrieval of the last line here starts with the watery nature of the twin ing suffixes of the past participles in the first line. Something will be doubled into something not like itself, swimming and listening, dolphin swimmers and humans. In a characteristic Valentine plain style, the poem proposes gradual deductive shifts from the general to the specifics of the case. Things become toward, move from a small known thing into what they do not know. That is, as Lucretius suggests about the swerve of atoms, it's all in the nature of things. Here is another poem written years after listening, but that produces the same effect. Letter. The hornet holds on to the curtain, winter sleep, rubs her legs, climbs the curtain. Behind her, the cedars sleep lightly, like guests. But I am the guest. The ghost cars climb the ghost highway. Even my hand over the page adds to the room tone a little constant wind, the effort of becoming. These words are my life, the effect of loving the unbecome, to make the suffering visible, the unbecome love. What we lost, a leaf, what we cherish, a leaf, one leaf of grass. I'm sending you this seed pod, this red ribbon, my tongue, these two red ribbons, my mouth, my other mouth, but the other world, blindly I guzzle the swimming milk of its seed, field flower. The twinning and doubling are part of the creation of this poem, two ribbons, two efforts, two mouths, two leaves, one lost and one found. When I asked Jean in our conversation in 2001 why she was drawn to shorter forms, she said she didn't know why, but she felt concise or minimalist forms were more apt to capture experience for her. Of contemporary poetry, she noted, I can see what lots of people are doing is good in various ways, but it doesn't interest me. She spoke of being influenced by and drawn to the work of Elizabeth Bishop, Jane Cooper, and Adrienne Rich, though her work didn't always resemble theirs. She also spoke of feeling spiritually connected to Mandelstam, Celan, Tranströmer, and was drawn with meticulous care to the phrase as an individual unit. We can see that in Letter, the effort of loving, the unbecome. Often the mysterious and the ordinary are so close in her pieces they are interfacing as the wasp in Letter climbs and clings to the curtain between the forms of existence. I'm deeply grateful for the complex economy of her poetry and find her poems are such great company in this time. Please keep her poetry in your life. Thank you.
I'm Mark Doty, and I'm happy to be here to speak with you about our late friend Jean Valentine and her extraordinary work. It's an honor to join this company. Would that I were there in person. Of all the poets that I've known, I think Jean Valentine had the least boundary between herself and her work. It's hard to explain quite what I mean by that, but it's partly about her voice. The way the person who speaks on the page is unmistakably the interior, concentrated version of the person who spoke to me in her apartment on 110th Street, or in a rented clapboard summer house in Little Compton, Rhode Island, or walking in the garden of a farmhouse in Sligo. We were friends for nearly 30 years. We'd have ordinary conversations, of course, about work or business or friends, but the ones I'm thinking of go further, often about poetry, about love, the work of writing, marriage, and grief, matters of consequence. Often something I'd say would be met with a little smile of recognition or an intake of breath. A particularly memorable look of Jean. She'd raise her eyebrows in surprise, her lips would sort of curve around her teeth, and she'd shake her head back and forth, a look that meant, oh, it could be true. Then she'd listen in silence for a moment or a while, and it seemed then she was listening in part still to me, but also attending at the same time to an interior space, waiting for it to fill with what she'd have to say. I never felt that she was already preparing her response while I spoke. Instead, she listened until words materialized in a place of their own, as if inside the cave of their becoming. When a response came, it might be shot through with humor and lightness, maybe mixed with sorrow, maybe simply a yes, offered with a look so completely accepting as to make one feel entirely seen. I tell you this story because I think it must have been something like the way she composed her poems, in a state of receptive attention. She'd talk about this sometimes as if it were a passive act, like taking dictation from an angel, or like the poet in Jean Cocteau's film Orpheus, who sits in an enchanted Rolls Royce, turns on the radio, and writes down the strange and beautiful phrases that come to the static, like messages broadcast from the underworld. But it's clear that this was an active work of listening, a kind of meditative practice. I think Jean was listening for the right phrase, the poem's authentic next move, and that this kind of listening was work. In Cocteau's film, the voice dictating lines of poetry from the underworld says, the mirrors would do well to reflect further. I think that might have been an injunction Jean followed, listening for whatever phrase or image was fetched up from dream or the unconscious or the ether, turning it around in her awareness, waiting for the response to form. This loyalty to the given is the wellspring of her most profound work, extraordinary poems which catch so much of what it is to be present in this life. And it's also the source of her most private and opaque poems, ones I feel I can't find access to. Those cryptic seeming pieces are necessary, though, to the whole. You can't be loyal to just some of your intuition, some of the figures given to you in a dream. The price of complete loyalty is a sometimes deeply mysterious lyric, and mystery can either deeply engage or merely frustrate. I know Jean herself felt flummoxed when readers said they didn't get a poem of hers. She felt she had been absolutely clear, and there was no means of articulation available to her that might be more so. And in fact, when you read the body of her work, the obscure patches become less so, their method more accessible in its contribution to the whole. To my mind, poetry invites us to value individuality, a person's particular ways of knowing and speaking, over accessibility. Of course we want to be understood, but understood as ourselves, on our own terms, and therefore poems might ask of readers the same kind of intent listening Jean practiced. If we read receptively, allow a line of a poem to take its time and form in us a personal, felt relation to what we hear, what worlds might open for us. I'm going to read just one poem of Jean's, one I've carried with me as a source of strength and consolation and the best reminder of her presence. It's a daring poem, beginning with looking as if from a high window in the city down to the bodies of men and women moving on Broadway below, thinking of the speaker and her lover in another physical and psychic space. And then the poem does one of Jean's characteristic turns. I think the sonnet form was deeply embedded in her practice of writing. So many of her poems contain a volta, a dramatic turn that shifts perspective, answers a question, resolves an issue. Here the poem turns on the introduction of a second voice, the under voice, the title tells us, which might be the voice of God, or of the life force, or of the watchful spirit of being itself looking out at the world through all our eyes. Who dares to bring that voice onto the stage of a poem? The under voice. I saw streaming up out of the sidewalk the homeless women and men, the east side of Broadway, fruit and flowers and bourbon, the homeless men like dull knives, gray-lipped, the homeless women, connected to no one, streaming no one to no one. More like light than like people. Blue neon, blue the most fugitive of all the colors. Then I looked and saw our bodies, not near, but not far out, lying together, our whiteness. And the undervoice said, "Stars, you are mine. You have always been mine. I remember the minute on the birth table when you were born, I riding with my feet up in the wide silver blue stirrups. I came and came and came. Little baby and woman, where were you taking me? Everyone else may leave you. I will never leave you, fugitive." Thank you.
Thank you again to AWP for allowing us to celebrate this great poet. Thank you to these extraordinary presentations, these poets who just brought so much of Jean's richness to life. And their books are available, our books are available, I believe, outside the auditorium, and the three of us, at least, are available for signing. Thank you so much.